It began with a sound, not a crash, not the tearing of steel that you might expect. The men who lived through what came next remembered it as a thud, a single heavy jolt that came up through the soles of their shoes, through the deck plates, through the whole long spine of the ship. And then the deck did something a deck is never supposed to do. It humped. The steel underfoot rose for just a moment, as if the lake had put a shoulder beneath the hull and pushed. It was about 25 minutes to 6 in the evening, the 18th of November, 1958. The Carl D. Bradley was running for home across a black and heaving Lake Michigan, empty of cargo, riding high in a gale that had been building all day. In the pilot house, First Mate Elmer Fleming reached for the radio. He keyed the microphone and spoke the words that a sailor spends a whole career hoping never to say. Mayday, Mayday. This is the Carl D. Bradley. He gave the position. He said the ship was breaking up, and then behind him and beneath him, the lights of the Bradley went out. First the accommodation, then the deck, then the running lights, until there was nothing left in all that dark water but the wind and 35 men and the two halves of a ship that had, until a moment ago, been the pride of a small Michigan town. The question that would occupy the next several years, the question that has never entirely been put to rest, is a simple one. Why did she break? To understand the Bradley, you have to understand what she was built to carry and where she was built to carry it. She was a self-unloader, a limestone carrier, launched in the spring of 1927 from the yards of the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio. When she went into the water, she was 639 feet long, and that made her, for a time, the longest ship on the Great Lakes. The Queen of the Lakes, they called that title, and the Bradley wore it for more than 2 decades before a newer, longer vessel finally took it from her. She was named for the president of the company that owned her, and that company was rooted in a single place, Rogers City, Michigan, a quarry town on the northern shore of Lake Huron. Just outside it lay the port of Calcite, one of the largest open-pit limestone quarries in the world. The Bradley and her fleetmates existed to move that stone down through the lakes to the mills and the furnaces that needed it, and then home again, empty, to load once more. By 1958, she was 31 years old. That is not in itself alarming for a lake boat. These vessels are built to last, and they are worked hard through short, violent seasons. But she was aging. Her owners had already decided that she was due for a new cargo hold, a major refit planned for that coming winter. The inspection standard of the day was limited. A lake carrier of that age was surveyed on a schedule by her classification society and by the federal steamboat inspectors, who examined the hull, the plating and the fittings and certified whether she was fit to sail. Those surveys were visual and structural. They could measure wastage and find a crack a man could see, but they did not routinely test the toughness of the steel itself. Her most recent inspection had pronounced her hull to be, in the language of the paperwork, in satisfactory condition. Satisfactory. That word would matter later, when men in a hearing room argued about what the steel of the 1920s could and could not endure. On the 17th of November, the Bradley delivered a load of limestone to Gary, Indiana, at the bottom of Lake Michigan. Then she turned north for home, empty. An empty ship rides high, and here the practice of the trade matters. A carrier that has discharged her cargo takes on water ballast to press her hull back down into the sea and steady her, and a prudent master in heavy weather ballasts deep. The Bradley carried ballast tanks for exactly this. Even so, a light hull is thrown around more freely by the sea, and the long, flat deck of a self-unloader has a great deal of length to flex. There was, too, the settled November habit of the lakes, which was to respect the month. The late-season gales on Lake Michigan were known and forecast, and cautious masters would hold in the lee of the land or wait out the worst in a sheltered harbor. The crew had good reason to want to get home. The season was nearly over, winter lay-up was coming, and with it the refit and a stretch of weeks ashore. There were 35 men aboard. Her master was Captain Roland Bryan, an experienced lakes captain who knew this weather and this route. First, mate Elmer Fleming was 43. Among the deck watchmen were Frank Mays, who was 26, and Gary Strzelecki and Dennis Meredith. Most of the crew came from Rogers City itself, or from the small towns around it. They were neighbors. They were the men you saw at church, at the hardware store, at the diner. On a boat like the Bradley, the crew list and the town's telephone book were very nearly the same document. By late afternoon on the 18th, the gale had grown into something serious. Winds of storm force, seas building toward 20 and 25 feet, and by some accounts, higher still. The Bradley was working her way up the eastern side of Lake Michigan, meaning to pass through the Beaver Island archipelago and into the shelter of the straits before turning for home. Captain Bryan altered course, laying the ship to run before the weather as best he could. She was, by every indication, handling it, riding it out, doing what these ships do in November on these lakes, which is to endure. And then, at about 5:35 in the evening, she made that sound. What follows is a timeline. It is brief because it happened quickly. At roughly 5:35, the thud, the vibration, the deck heaving upward amidships. Captain Bryan sounded the general alarm to abandon ship, and Fleming sent the Mayday, giving a position some miles southwest of Gull Island. Within moments, the ship broke in two. She jackknifed, the two halves folding down and away from one another as the middle failed and the lights died as the power went. The stern section, with the engine room and most of the crew, and the bow section, went their separate ways into the dark. The sea was doing something close to its worst. 25-foot waves, water in the low 40s, a wind that tore the tops off the seas and drove the spray flat. 4 men reached one of the ship's life rafts, an 8-foot raft, a small flat platform, no cabin, no shelter, nothing to hold but the raft itself. Fleming was one and Mays another. With them were Gary Strzelecki and Dennis Meredith. For the next 15 hours, those 4, and then fewer, held onto that raft in the dark. The seas flipped it repeatedly, throwing the men into the water and leaving them to climb back on again and again through a night that would not end. Dennis Meredith was lost in one of those capsizes, swept away in the black water and not seen again. Gary Strzelecki held on longer. He was still alive when help finally came, but the cold had gone too deep, and he died not long after he was pulled from the raft. Somewhere out in that same darkness, other ships had already begun to move. A German freighter, the Christian Sartori, had been close enough to see it happen, a column of flame against the black, and her captain turned his vessel into the teeth of the storm to search, though the same seas that had broken the Bradley made the search very nearly impossible, and the United States Coast Guard put boats out into the gale. The cutter Hollyhock came up through the night from Sturgeon Bay, and one of the men aboard her would later describe that passage as a visit to hell. It was the following morning, the 19th of November, after 15 hours on the raft, that a Coast Guard cutter finally found the 2 men who were left. Frank Mays and Elmer Fleming were lifted from that small platform alive, cold to the bone, their clothing crusted with ice, but alive. Of the 35 men who had sailed on the Carl D. Bradley, 33 did not come home. 15 of them were never recovered at all. So we return to the question the cold open left hanging. Why did she break? There is a plain, blunt answer, and it is where the official inquiry began: the sea. A 31-year-old hull, riding high and empty, taking a full-force November gale on the beam and then on the quarter. The Coast Guard Marine Board that investigated the loss concluded that the Bradley had failed under excessive stress, that the great seas had worked the long hull until it hogged, bending the ends down and the middle up, until the steel amidships simply could not take any more and let go. Heavy weather, an old ship in a bad place at a bad time. If that were the whole of it, this would be a sad story, but a simple one. It is not the whole of it. Because when the Marine Board's report reached the Commandant of the Coast Guard for review, he did not fully accept it. He set aside the pure hogging theory and reached instead for a phrase that is quieter and in some ways more troubling: an undetected structural weakness or defect. Something wrong inside the ship that no inspection had found, the very ship that had been pronounced, only recently, in satisfactory condition. And here, the story reaches the thing that would haunt Great Lakes shipping for years to come: the steel itself. Ships built before roughly the late 1940s were made, in many cases, from a kind of steel that engineers would later come to view with real unease. It could be notch-sensitive and brittle in the cold. Under the wrong combination of low temperature and sudden load and a small floor, such steel could fail by cracking, a fracture running fast through metal that ought to have been tough. The Bradley was a ship of the 1920s. She had been built from what was available in the 1920s. Against this, the Lake Carriers Association, the industry body speaking for the fleets, pushed back hard. They rejected the idea that there was some hidden weakness in the Bradley or in ships like her. In their account, the fault lay with the weather, and the weather alone. The ship had been sound, and the sea had simply been more than any ship should have been asked to face. So you are left, as the inquiry was left, with two accounts standing side by side. The Marine Board pointed to stress and heavy weather. The Commandant pointed to an undetected structural defect. The industry insisted there had been no defect at all. And beneath all three ran the unresolved question of the steel, a question that no one, in 1958, could answer with certainty, because the evidence lay in two pieces at the bottom of Lake Michigan. That question would not stay buried. 8 years later, on another lake, another old carrier of the same era, the Daniel J. Morrell, would break apart in a November storm in almost the same way, and the brittle steel argument would come roaring back. The Bradley was not the last word. The loss of the Carl D. Bradley did not produce a single dramatic reform that you can point to and say, here, this is what her 33 men bought. Change on the Great Lakes came slowly, and it came from an accumulation of losses, hers among them. But her sinking sharpened the questions. It put the brittle steel problem and the aging of the pre-war fleet squarely in front of the men whose job it was to worry about such things. It fed a growing scrutiny of hull inspection, of how you certify a 30-year-old ship as satisfactory when the flaw that might kill her is invisible from the outside. And it added its weight to the slow retirement of the oldest vessels and to the harder look that would eventually be taken at what steel a lake boat was made of and how she was surveyed. The Beaver Island waters where she went down are shallow enough that both halves of the Bradley were eventually located, lying on the lake floor. They are, and will remain, a grave, and they are treated as one. Return at the end to the town. Rogers City was a small place, a few thousand people gathered around a quarry and a harbour. In the space of a single storm, it lost 23 of its men, 23 from one town, from one ship, on one night. In the week that followed, the funerals came almost without pause. There were households that had lost a father and would raise children who barely remembered him. There were streets on which more than one door wore black. The cemetery gained a section it had not needed the week before. An entire community stood at the edge of the same water that gave it work and took its men. Frank Mays lived. He carried the story for more than 60 years, telling it and telling it again to anyone who would listen. He was, in the end, the last of them, and when he was gone, the last living voice went with him. The Carl D. Bradley and the 33 who did not come home, most of them from one small town on the shore of a great lake, on the longest night that town would ever know.